Terrific. Good morning. My name is Heidi Young with the DHHS Bureau of Housing Supports. And we're in some pretty exciting times right now for our Bureau and for the Balance of States Continuum of Care. Good morning, Kathy. Thanks for joining us. So for those of you that are just joining or have been with us for a few minutes, if you could please in the chat, put your name and the agency that you're representing and how you're sharing this space with us along with your pronouns. We'd love to have you on board and listening to the session with us and hopefully be able to answer some questions for you about the amazing things that are coming out today. So again, this is the New Hampshire Balance of States Continuum of Care, the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program, and the Request for Proposals information session. So if we can go to the next slide. So we're going to look at the overview of this project itself and give you some background. Review some of these projects that are coming out that you are able to apply for, which we're really, I just keep saying it, I know we're very excited about this. The HUD requirements around these projects, and then really leave some time open for some question and answer for folks. Next slide. So how did we get here? I feel like it happened way before September of 2021, but the Balance of State received an award of $2.2 million as a round 4-5 YHDP Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program recipient community. That award kicked off with a coordinated community planning process that has been going on since that time with a whole bunch of people. We have the Bureau of Housing Supports who have been leading this with our Youth Success Project and the entire the Balance of States Youth Subcommittee members. That planning process included an assessment of need and the development of this coordinated community plan that we are in the final stages of completing to prevent and end youth homelessness in New Hampshire. Those projects were designed to meet the unique needs of youth and young adults experiencing homelessness and housing instability in this geographic region that we're talking about as the Balance of States Continuum of Care. So the process to award YHDP funded projects is a huge part of that. And this is the exciting time of it. So we've been putting this plan together. We're putting out this request for proposals for you to apply. And we're actually going to be able to give money that's sustainable for people to run these projects. So I haven't been more thrilled in quite a while for something like this to happen. So I'm pretty excited about it. Yes, next slide, please. So when we're talking about this whole youth homelessness demonstration program planning process, we have the coordinated community planning that I just spoke about and that we're coming towards the end of. And right now we're in the phase of project design and selection. So we've done the project design and we're going to share that with you and looking toward or forward to the selection process. And then that third phase of the implementation and quality improvement continuously around that piece. So yeah, next slide. Some of you may have seen this before, our vision and mission for our Continuum of Care. I won't read it to you. It's a little lengthy, but it really entails all the things that we've been talking about in terms of our youth subcommittee. How are we going to end youth homelessness? How are we looking at it as a system? How are we talking to one another? How are we including youth and young adults in that work? So I think the critical piece of that is knowing that we're heading somewhere, and I'm pretty excited about it. So I know I've said that a few times. Next slide. So funding. Our full award was $2,246,831.51. I'm kind of amazed at the 51 cents, but that's okay. So when HUD gives us funding, they include planning grant money, which we utilized in the form of $224,683.15. $145,000 of that we are looking to put towards coordinated entry processes and homeless management information systems capacity building, so that because our homeless management information system requires us to put information into it for these grants, we are looking to fund being able to do that exactly and run reports on it, look at quality improvement around it, and really being able to utilize that data. For the projects themselves, we are looking at a 2-year amount of $1.7 million to serve youth in our communities. So that money will go out to hopefully all of you that are applying. And then the annual amount for those projects will be $866,074. Okay, next slide. In terms of the timeline for this, so we put the RFP out on the 15th of April, and it's being released for 30 days. We're having our information session today for you to learn more about what we're talking about. May 13th, we're looking for the applications to be due by 4 o'clock, so please get them in before then. June 3rd, we will plan to award those projects. We will let you all know your awards. And then we have to then take that information and get it to HUD in their internal process called eSNAPs by July 1st. So that's really the timeline for us. April, May, and June is a tight turnaround, but we're looking to get it done. So, all right, we will go to the next slide, hopefully. And I will pass this over to Ellen from our Technical Assistance Collaborative, who will be able to share with you the rest of our presentation. So thanks, Ellen.
Thanks, Heidi. So my name is Ellen Fitzpatrick. I use she, her pronouns. I am with TAC, as Heidi said. And as part of your YHDP award, you all receive HUD-funded technical assistance throughout the 2-year demonstration period. So myself and my colleague, Ayana Gonzalez, both from TAC, have been supporting the process. You also have some technical assistance from True Colors United, which is focused on youth collaboration, and some technical assistance from the National Center on Homeless Education, focused on doing some education work. So a lot of support, which is really nice, and hopefully provides you all with some peace of mind knowing that the support will be there as you're, for those of you who are awarded, as you're getting these projects off the ground too. So I'm now going to talk through the actual project designs that came out of the Balance of States, many advisory team meetings, core leadership team meetings, all of the great work that this community did to get to a place where you looked at the need and then came up with projects, designed them to address those needs specifically. So the first one is what folks have called the Youth Navigation Team. So this is a supportive services project where support services staff are essentially situated at kind of like the front door of your homeless response system. So they are people that young folks would be connected to at the beginning of their experience of homelessness. The case management, or the services rather, that this type of team would provide would be focused on things like diversion or housing problem solving, trying to find safe alternatives to homelessness for young people who have entered the system, connecting young people with shelter or other housing resources that they might want or need. And also, folks talked a lot about how there is a lack of continuity in case management, and young people meet someone, share their story, and then get passed off to somebody else in a different program. And so having this navigation team work with folks through to the point where they're connected to a permanent housing placement to help provide some of that continuity, as well as to ensure that people aren't falling through the cracks, aren't showing up and then disappearing because there is no one to support them through that sort of waiting period while they're, looking to identify a permanent housing solution. So the target population for this type of project would be young people who are under the age of 24 and who meet either the category 1, 2, or 4 of the HUD homelessness definition. And we're going to go into a little bit more detail in probably 10 or 15 minutes around what that definition says, but it would be 1, 2, or 4. And then in terms, for those of you who are familiar with Continuum of Care program funding, the type of project that this would be funded as is called Support Services Only, or Supportive Services Only, an SSO project. I'm going to go through all of them, and then we'll have some time for questions, plenty of time at the end. But if you have them as you're hearing me talk, feel free to throw them in the chat if you don't want to forget, and we can come back to them.
And Ellen, I'm kind of manning the chat. So as things pop up, I'm kind of addressing them if I can, and then we can bring them back to the conversation as well.
Awesome. That's perfect. Thanks, Melissa. So the next project that was designed by the advisory team and core leadership team in New Hampshire was low barrier crisis transitional housing. So folks identified that especially in some of the more rural areas of the Balance of State continuum, there are no crisis or temporary housing options for young people or very few, not no, but very few options for safe places where folks can stay when they do find themselves, in a housing crisis. So folks identified the need for some type of emergency housing solution. The Continuum of Care program cannot fund emergency shelter, but what it can fund is low barrier transitional housing that operates more like emergency shelter than some of the more traditional transitional housing that folks might be familiar with, where you expect, a 2-year length of stay and the services are really focused on getting people housing ready. This would be kind of a departure from that and function a little bit differently. So the design that folks identified was, again, that low barrier crisis transitional housing that provides immediate, safe, and identity affirming, LGBTQ plus affirming, short-term housing option for young people who need a safe place to stay immediately without preconditions for entry. So that's that low barrier piece. Not requiring that folks, are sober and not using in order to come in, not requiring that folks have a background check, those sorts of things. This type of model can be done in a congregate setting where, there's maybe a building that's leased or owned, and there's multiple rooms or units in that same building. Or it can be operated in a way that functions more like scattered site, where there are several units or properties leased or owned in the community that are operated as transitional housing. Ideally, with this model, the goal, like I mentioned, is not to have folks stay for 2 years, but rather to move them on to permanent housing as quickly as possible, as soon as they're ready and interested in pursuing that option. Of course, you would never want to ask someone to leave before they feel ready or before they're interested, but the case management would really be housing focused and working on connecting folks to the housing opportunities that they're interested in. So for this type of project, the target population would be young people who are age 18 to 24. And that's because in a transitional housing project, HUD does require that young folks would sign an occupancy agreement to stay in that transitional housing bed. It doesn't have to be for a certain length of time. It's not, as binding as a lease. It can be sort of as flexible as the project wants it to be. But in most states, youth who are under the age of 18 are not legally allowed to sign that kind of document. So in most communities, we see folks targeting people who are 18 to 24 or emancipated minors who are allowed to sign that kind of document. If a project was interested in serving minors in this, in a low barrier crisis transitional housing, that's something that we could explore or talk more about. But this is typically the age range that we see. And again, those folks would have to meet categories 1, 2, or 4 of the HUD homelessness definition. This type of project could function in one of 2 sort of HUD project categories. So HUD does allow you to fund just straight up transitional housing, or they also have this other type of project that they call the joint component, transitional housing and rapid rehousing. So this would be one single project that has both funding for the transitional housing piece. So whether that's funding to operate a building that you own, funding to lease units or to lease a property to operate transitional housing. And then it would also have some rental assistance attached to it. So the young people in that transitional housing portion would have like a really streamlined and immediate connection to a rental assistance resource because they could move from one to the other very seamlessly within the same project. So it's HUD's sort of way of encouraging communities to move away from that more traditional transitional housing model and really make it housing focused and to try to operate with a housing first approach and move people on as quickly as possible. The third type of project that was designed in this community planning process are host homes. So these are typically safe places for young people to stay with trusted adults in the community in order to provide a crisis housing option that typically allows young people to remain in the communities of their choice. So typically that would be like their community of origin. Maybe they are in a more rural area, and in order to have, a crisis housing option, they would have to go to a more service-rich area, a more urban area. Host homes are often a way to allow folks to have that short-term temporary housing option when they need it without having to leave, their town or their city. So in this design, it would operate like that short to medium-term crisis housing option with housing-focused case management, really focused again on a longer-term solution for the young people that were using this resource. And supports would also be provided to those host families or to those trusted adults who are opening their homes to be hosts. This can operate in one of two ways, and it can be a combination. So those of you who are familiar with host homes may know, often they operate where the project is recruiting hosts. So they have, a list or a group of people in the community who are willing to be hosts, who have been vetted, and then they do some work when young people are referred to the project or are in need to match them to a host that would, best suit their needs. So that's one model. And the other looks a little bit more like kinship care, where maybe a young person is experiencing homelessness or housing instability, but has identified their own host in the community. Maybe it's the parent of a friend, maybe it's a distant relative. But in this situation, it would still be considered a host home, and the same supports would be available to the young person staying with those friends or family. So there's a little bit of flexibility here, but ultimately this was born from the need for some of those more rural areas to have short-term crisis options for young people. The target population would be youth age 24 or younger. Some communities have targeted minors for host homes, and that does sometimes present some challenges in terms of partnering with child welfare and ensuring that folks are doing everything that is legally required and a best practice regarding safety. So if that is something that an applicant is interested in, there is some support there to help figure that out. And host homes are also a really wonderful option for young people ages 18 to 24. And this would be funded as a supportive services only project. So there's no rental assistance or anything like that attached to this type of project, but there is an opportunity to include some funding that would provide stipends to those host families. We'll talk more about that later on as well. The fourth type of project that was designed by this community planning process is rapid rehousing. So this is medium to longer term rental assistance. Typically it's 24 months of assistance, but with YHDP, there is an opportunity to request a waiver to go up to 36 months of assistance. And that would be both rental assistance and supportive services. So really focused on helping young people to obtain and maintain housing and stability in that housing. So rapid rehousing can look like a lot of different things. It can be shared housing, so like roommate situations. It can be independent living. It's really very flexible and very focused on what each individual young person wants and needs. But really, this is a straight up housing project with the goal of getting folks, into permanent housing and helping them to stabilize there. So the case management in a rapid rehousing project is typically focused on, initially that housing search and placement, and then on things like getting young people connected to, the education and employment opportunities that they're most interested in, helping folks apply for benefits and get connected to healthcare. All of those sorts of things that really help somebody to maintain stability once they're stably housed. So this type of project would be targeted to young people ages 18 to 24, again, because of that requirement that they will have a lease with the landlord or with the agency. So typically that means that youth who are under the age of 18 are not allowed to sign that sort of document, but emancipated minors could be eligible. And again, folks would have to meet categories 1, 2, or 4 of HUD's homelessness definition. And rapid rehousing is its own project type with HUD. So that's what this sort of, that's the bucket that it would fall under here. And then finally, the last project type that was designed by the community is permanent supportive housing. So permanent supportive housing is a non-time limited rental assistance and supportive services resource, typically targeted to young people or to people who are the most vulnerable in a community and have the highest needs. So the services are really meant to be intensive and wraparound, and there is actually an eligibility restriction for this type of resource that only young folks who have a documented disability would be eligible for the housing resource. So again, just kind of underscoring the fact that this is really a resource that's targeted to folks who have a higher level of need. So in this project type, youth would at entry have to be between ages 18 and 24. They would have to meet those 3 HUD homelessness definition categories, one of the 3, and they would also have to have that disabling condition in order to be eligible. And there is an error on this slide that I will correct before we share the slides with folks, but the HUD project type should say permanent supportive housing because that is, again, its own sort of standalone project type under the Continuum of Care program. So I just shared with you 5 different project designs, and you might remember the budget slide that Heidi shared, where it showed that the annual amount that will be awarded to these projects, sort of the annual budget amount that they'll have to be working within, is that $866,000. So it is unlikely that you all will fund all 5 of those types of projects, right? So this is just a note to be aware that, of course, everything will be dependent on what kinds of applications come in. And there will be a review team who is scoring those applications and who ultimately will be charged with, awarding funds based on the highest application scores and potentially doing some negotiation or having some conversations with applicants on the back end to talk through, maybe doing some budget revisions if, they only receive X number of applications for X amount and folks, they have to ask folks to take on a little bit more funding or maybe to scale their budgets back a little bit to accommodate an additional project. Just know that there may be some of that figuring out on the back end with the review team. Because ultimately, the goal is to create projects that will serve as many young people as possible in New Hampshire in the most effective ways, obviously with programming that is in line with the community's values. So we're excited to see what comes in. I also just want to note some of the additional priorities that folks have identified in this planning process, both through community advisory and core leadership team meetings, as well as some of the specific priorities of the Youth Success Project. So projects that value and emphasize youth choice, not only for young people ages 18 to 24, but also for minors, are really a priority. YSP wants to see projects that value the fact that young people are experts in their own lives and experiences and honoring that. Projects that plan to include young people in the design and implementation of their programming are also a priority, whether this is in an advisory capacity or in a staff capacity, hiring folks with lived experience. Projects that have a clear plan to connect all youth who are enrolled to a permanent housing placement are also a priority. Some of these projects, like I said, are housing projects, so that's very clear, right? But some of them are more, crisis housing or supportive services focused. So really wanting to make sure that any applications for those projects very clearly identify how not only they're, going to provide the services that they're committing to, but also how they then plan to connect those young people enrolled to a longer-term permanent housing option. We've also heard loud and clear throughout this process that there are some more rural and underserved parts of the COC's geography. So projects that commit to serving a wider part of the geography or some of those areas that are specifically underserved are definitely a priority. And then finally, projects that operate with a lens of racial and LGBTQIA+ equity. So knowing that equity has been at the forefront of this planning process, It should be at the forefront of project design, and certainly will be something that folks are continuing to look at through the continuous quality improvement and evaluation project, or process rather, both of the projects that are implemented as well as the implementation of your coordinated community plan. So before I go into some of the HUD requirements for these projects, I want to pause and maybe, Melissa, if there's anything from the chat that you want to highlight or questions that we should answer out loud, we can make some time for that if it's helpful.
There have been a few questions and comments about host homes for minors and how they have to go through the state of New Hampshire foster care licensing process if they are for minors. And there was a question just now about if wards of the state would be included as target audiences, if applicable. So for that last question, my guess is probably not, because if they are considered wards of the state, they would be in DCYF. What is it? Something in control. There's a word, there's a phrase that the legal meaning of they are their guardian. They are their legal guardian.
Care and
Custody,
control.
care and control.
Mhm.
So legally, DCYF, state of New Hampshire, is their guardian, which would put them into a foster home, not a host home. There may be some situations where a minor gets permission from their parent or legal guardian to stay in another person's home where it wouldn't have to be a licensed foster home. We may not be able to pay them as host homes. It may be the supportive services side of things, but that one, I think it would be a case-by-case situation that we would have to look at individually as they came up. And that's what the BHS team would be here for. When you get those questions or those unique situations, you would come to us and we would work through it.
I would imagine it could also, the ones in which a guardian is involved enough to have given permission, that it may count under the kinship care portion. That's what I'm thinking.
Yep.
Yeah.
Good point.
Yeah.
Yep. So I think that in those minor situations, there will be a lot of consulting as a team to work through the logistics, because this is new to New Hampshire. We haven't done this before in this way. So we will be learning together as we work through each situation.
And it's not necessarily new for Waypoint, although it's funded very differently, right? Some differences between HUD and FISB. So just throwing it out there that I'm happy to consult as these things come up, because many of these programs are programs that we already provide through FISB. So
yeah,
just an offer. I'm really happy that others may be throwing their hat in the ring and providing a similar service and support. So
definitely.
yeah.
So thank you for that, Mandy. I think what I will ask is if there are awards that go out for this type of project and you have project related questions, I would ask that you bring them to BHS first, because we are the recipients to HUD. So we are responsible for making sure we're in line with our grant, but Mandy will pull you in probably more often than you want us to.
Yeah,
so
that is not an offer to assist with that portion, but once folks have established their contracts and consulting around program based.
Okay, gotcha.
Yes.
And then Patty, you just asked a question that I'm not entirely sure how to answer. Could you
Yep.
Are you comfortable coming off mute?
Oh, I can actually answer that question.
Okay, go.
Yeah, so this is a little bit of a blurry line where HUD says YHDP funds have to be used for new projects, not for expansion. However, there are some scenarios where you may be doing a really wonderful job operating rapid rehousing, for example, at your organization, and you want to do more youth rapid rehousing. You can apply for a new rapid rehousing project, and just because you have an existing one, you might model it to look exactly like that, but it has to technically be a new project. You can't apply and say, we want to expand this thing that we already do. They want it to be identified as something new. So that is also something that, you know, once projects are awarded, you'll have the BHS team, you'll have technical assistance, and that's something that we can support you all to navigate with those applications. Cindy, I see your hand up. You can go ahead.
Yes, so we are possibly going to submit for a host home project for our Safe Families for Children program aimed at youth specifically. But I had a couple of questions. So we were looking at possibly two different scenarios. One that might possibly be focused more on pregnant youth or youth that have a child that are within that age bracket. And then the other thing that if we open it up to all youth within that age bracket, our host homes are voluntary. And I know under the Housing First, it's low barrier. So some of the youth might have substance abuse or other problems, but these are people that are voluntarily taking children into their own home that have other children that may not want to bring in a child that has substance abuse. But we do have a number of partner agencies that we work with and refer to try to get them help. Would that still, would that be a barrier if we have partner agencies that we're working with to help them work on that before they come into our host home?
It would be a barrier if it's a requirement to come into the host home. So if you're saying you have to be in treatment or you have to have resolved your substance use before we will put you in a host home, then that's not Housing First. If you are housing somebody and offering services, not required services, then that would be okay. But it cannot be a requirement of getting housing.
I will add too, though, that I think particularly with host homes, there's a lot of work that you can do on the front end to make sure that, yeah, you're not, you know, denying anyone entry to the project based on those things, but that their placements are really carefully thought through. Where, yeah, if you have a host family who's volunteered and has several young children, maybe that isn't the greatest fit for a young person who's not ready to stop using or not interested in stopping using. And so I think rather than, to Melissa's point, denying entry, it would be more, okay, let's try to find you a host that will fit, that you will be comfortable with, that will be comfortable with you, so that it's, you know, a good match.
Okay.
Yeah. And you can definitely target pregnant and parenting youth. I think that's a wonderful idea.
Okay, so if the project is aimed at targeting a specific population and we're not just being broad open to all 18 to 24, will that project still qualify?
It will certainly be considered for scoring. Absolutely.
Okay.
I can't say it would be funded or not funded because we're not in the review team yet, but it it would be definitely considered for scoring.
Okay, and as part of the project, are you, because it includes supportive services, so we were looking at possibility of some additional staffing to recruit more host homes and get those host homes supported, as well as once we are doing the placements that we would have more staff available for the case management and supportive services that we're providing the youth with all around wraparound care. So are both of those eligible funding within that project?
Yep, supportive services dollars can absolutely be used to fund staffing and case management and all of the things that you just described.
And I saw in there, and maybe I missed it, but somebody had asked about, so there's the initial funding for the projects is about 2 years. What happens after the 2 years? Could there potentially be additional rounds of funding that could be applied for to continue the program or continue growing it?
Yeah, so the demonstration period, so the first award will be this initial 2-year period. But after that, all of these projects will continue to be renewed on an annual basis through the Continuum of Care program. So all of those existing COC funded projects, these will roll up underneath them and continue on. So they don't go away after 2 years. These are here to stay in New Hampshire, which is awesome.
And I heard some mention of possibly when you were talking about paying money out to like the host homes, but what would that be for? Is that more money directly for the care of the youth, like might help with some transportation needs or food needs or other like getting to work? What is that additional monies that you're anticipating might possibly be available within a project grant?
Yeah, so I would definitely encourage you to take a look at in the COC program interim rule, there's a long list of all of the eligible supportive services costs, some of which are things like you just described, paying for transportation, for groceries. This stipend for hosts is new. So this is a new flexibility that HUD has recently said. We know it can be hard to recruit host homes. If there is any benefit to having some financial incentive, you are allowed to do that up to $500. So they have not put any parameters around what that money would be used for. It would be a stipend paid directly to the host family. So you as a project could do with that what you see fit. So you could say, actually, it should only be 200 and we're going to ask them to use it for these things, or, you've got some flexibility there.
So the money could be used to help the youth get a vehicle or, things like that, or driver's ed or anything.
So those are, so the stipend would be given directly to the host family. Like it would
Okay.
be your project giving a check to Jim, whose family is hosting Billy. And then it would be up to Jim, what he did with that money. If he wanted to give it back to Billy to use to buy a car, that would be their prerogative. But HUD would say you can't give that money and say it's being used to buy a car because that's not an eligible cost. It has to just be called the stipend for that project. But all of these specific like eligible cost questions and all of that are things that for the projects that get awarded, we will sit down with you and we will go through the budgets and make sure that you feel very comfortable and confident in your understanding of what's allowable and what's not. And like I said, both TAC and BHS will be here through the implementation. So we'll be able to provide continued support around those things too.
Yep.
And
And
I think-
Cindy, the email that I sent out has links to the interim rule and the youth homelessness demonstration program application. So in the appendix A, so there are several different resources that you can read through to get a sense of what could be funded directly through this project.
Mhm.
And as Ellen said, we will be here to work through the budgets and eligible items for the selected applications. So when we do our review process, we only have a certain amount of money. So we anticipate a handful of projects will get selected. We unfortunately can't fund all of them. Ellen, I think I'm going off agenda, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Yeah.
So I think what we would do is for projects that are not selected, we always, with the balance of state, send out a letter explaining, like giving feedback on why projects were not selected. So you would get that, not you specifically, you in general, who might not be selected, would get that letter from us. And then projects that are selected are the ones we would sit down and spend the time working through the budget with. We wouldn't necessarily do that with the projects that weren't selected, just in the interest of time. But I do encourage you to look through those documents to get a sense of it. So when you're putting together your project proposal, the review team, I'm not a scorer. I'm facilitating the scorers. I don't know if that was clear. So the scoring team you want them to have a really clear understanding of what the project will do. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yes, thank you very much.
And just for others, Lisa asked a question about any restrictions on how many youth and young adults could be in one host home at any given time. HUD does not have that restriction. I would say if you are doing host homes for minors who have to be in a licensed foster home, there may be restrictions from the foster care licensing perspective.
Thanks, Melissa. All right, I'm going to move us along because I anticipate that the next section of content is going to bring up a lot of other questions too. So I am now going to walk through some of the HUD specific requirements for the projects that get funded in the balance of state. So first, just want to make sure that everyone is aware that in order to be eligible to apply for this funding at all, these subrecipients, you all will, awarded applicants will be subrecipients of BHS, and you will have to be either nonprofit organizations, state or local government entities, or instrumentalities of state and local government. So these funds essentially cannot go to for-profit companies or organizations. There are also some requirements around the location of funded projects. So I'm sure you're familiar with this map. This shows the New Hampshire Balance of State COC's geography, which is quite large. And so these projects have to serve young people who are presenting for assistance in that balance of state geography. It's a little tricky, or not tricky, but interesting, where HUD says the actual agency could be located outside of that geography. So for example, an organization in Nashua or Manchester could apply for these funds, but they would have to be serving young people in the balance of state geography. So they couldn't say, okay, great, we were awarded, you come to us now in Manchester. They would have to be committed to, implementing this project within the balance of state COC.
And we have an example of that. Waypoint's main office is in Manchester, but Waypoint does have a regular continuum of care rapid rehousing project that does serve youth that operates within our geography. So we just can't, it's the city of Manchester and then the city of Nashua and the 9 surrounding communities that are part of the greater Nashua continuum of care. If you have specific questions about that, reach out to us. It's a very small area that we don't cover.
Awesome. That's a helpful example too. Okay. So there are also some requirements around who can be served with these projects. So which young people will be eligible for the assistance once it's on the ground in New Hampshire. So young people in these projects will have to be age 24 or younger, so 24 and 364 days at the time that they enter the project. And this includes both unaccompanied youth, pregnant and parenting youth, and they would have to meet either 1, 2, or 4 of HUD's homelessness definition. So we'll provide a lot of support around this once you're at the implementation stage, but just to give folks a sense of what these categories mean. Category 1 is referred to as literally homeless. So this would be folks who are in either emergency shelter, transitional housing that is dedicated to people who are experiencing homelessness, or young people who are staying in places not meant for human habitation. So young folks who are sleeping in their cars or abandoned buildings or outside. Those are all people who would meet the category 1 definition. Category 2 refers to young folks who are imminently at risk of experiencing homelessness. So this typically means young people who are at risk of losing their primary nighttime residence within the next 14 days. And in YHDP, in many communities, category 2 feels very restrictive because they rely on, needing a court-ordered eviction and that sort of thing. But in YHDP, there's a little bit more flexibility, where, for example, a young person who maybe is staying with a friend or with a friend's family, and they've been asked to leave and told, you have until the weekend to get your stuff out. That would be an example of where a young person may meet the category 2 imminent risk definition. So it doesn't have to be at risk of losing a primary nighttime residence where they are, the sole leaseholder or something like that. There is some flexibility there. And then category 4 refers to young people who are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, and other dangerous situations. So there's a really helpful document that was created a couple of years ago for YHDP that I will share in the near future with you all that gives kind of a broader definition of category 4 to include, for example, young folks who are fleeing family violence at home or other forms of neglect or abuse in the home. Young folks who are fleeing maybe gang violence in the neighborhood that they currently live in. Young folks who are trading sex for housing or engaging in other behavior that may be considered unsafe or unhealthy. So, again, similar to category 2, in many housing programs, category 4 is very narrow and specific around domestic violence. But in YHDP, the definition is a little bit broader and can encompass young folks who are fleeing a whole slew of unsafe situations. So we'll provide some additional support around that too. And then just worth noting that there are no income restrictions for YHDP funded projects. So there's no income minimum, there's no income maximum. You don't have to consider that when you're thinking about eligibility for assistance. So beyond those 4 HUD categories, there are also some special target populations that were identified as populations that your community really wanted to focus on providing support and housing to through the planning process. So this includes LGBTQIA+ young people, BIPOC young people, knowing that youth who are LGBTQ+, Black youth, Hispanic youth are all typically, from what we see in the research, at higher risk of experiencing homelessness because of racial disparities, disparities in access to resources, pregnant and parenting young people, unaccompanied minors, youth who are systems involved, both with foster care and juvenile justice or the adult justice system, youth who are survivors of trafficking and exploitation, and then also young people who are immigrants or refugees, both documented and undocumented. So really just wanting to be aware of this list sort of being the beyond those HUD categories, the folks who your planning process identified as most in need in New Hampshire, most at risk of experiencing homelessness and the trauma that comes with it. So keeping that in mind when you're thinking about your programming and who it will be designed to serve and how you will provide those services in a culturally competent way. There are also some specific requirements for these projects from HUD, some that are a little bit more in the weeds, some that are a little bit more tied to sort of like your community values and the way that you will operate. So like I mentioned earlier, all of these projects will have to operate with a housing first orientation. So this really meaning that they're operating with the lens and the understanding that it's hard to ask people to address many of the challenges that many of us have if they don't have a safe place to stay. So knowing that housing should be the priority, and then once someone is stably housed, it's much easier to support them with all of the other things that they may want or need support with. These projects should also incorporate both positive youth development and trauma-informed care into the program design, the services that are provided, and the housing assistance that's provided. As Melissa mentioned, or Heidi mentioned earlier, these projects will all be required to enter participant level data into the New Hampshire Homeless Management Information System. So for those of you who may be new to HMIS, this will be something new to learn, to add, to your administrative capacities in your organization. But this is essentially how your community will be able to look at the impact of this work, the impact of these projects, because you'll be able to see who's being served, what the outcomes are for those folks. And HUD will be able to look at that as well through some of the required reporting processes from HMIS. These projects will also be required to participate in coordinated entry. So coordinated entry, in a nutshell, is essentially the way that your community organizes its housing resources, those that are Continuum of Care and Emergency Solutions grant funded. And what it does essentially is moves away from a first come, first serve model to one in which the process is streamlined for the people in need. There is an assessment process. There is a process for prioritizing folks based on your local priorities and preferences, and then a very streamlined process for referral. So participation will look different depending on the project type. A navigator project maybe will be tasked with completing assessments for coordinated entry, while a housing project would be required to take their referrals through coordinated entry. So that participation will look different, and it's something that, again, will provide support to the awarded projects around once we get to that point.
And I can share, there's a really comprehensive coordinated entry policy and procedure manual for the balance of state, and a subcommittee dedicated to the coordinated entry system work. And we have a balance of state, our balance of state continuum of care administrator is also our coordinated entry system lead. So there are supports in BHS to help understand the coordinated entry process. And there's a whole training series that I think we've done half of them so far that have been recorded, and the rest will be recorded, that will be available to you as well. So I encourage you not to get overwhelmed by coordinated entry right now, because it's really, there are like week-long conferences on this topic. You're not going to figure it all out in a few days while you're trying to write this. So just know that it's there and we will support you through it. And there are there are bumps, there are challenges, and we're constantly evaluating and adjusting our system. So please don't let it overwhelm you or scare you away.
Yes, and New Hampshire is not alone in constantly tweaking and refining. That is a nationwide common theme in coordinated entry. So a few more requirements that are just worth noting. First, that there are a couple of documents that are sort of the governing language for YHDP that you all should familiarize yourselves with at least a bit in applying for this funding. So first is the COC program interim rule. So this is the big, long, lengthy document that has all of the Continuum of Care program requirements, and YHDP funding sits under the Continuum of Care. So that's sort of the first one. There's also then the Notice of Funding Opportunity that you all received your YHDP award from. That NOFO, as well as appendices A and B, like Melissa mentioned, have a lot of really good information about how these programs need to operate, some of the other requirements. So those are a great resource. And then beyond the HUD requirements, you'll also have to, of course, comply with any of your local policies, written standards, those things at the Continuum of Care or state level as well. Projects should also have a plan for rapid implementation. We don't have an exact date for when HUD would be signing grant agreements, but if we can look at past rounds as sort of a crystal ball into what this future might look like, if you all are getting your applications into HUD and eSNAPs on July 1st, it's likely that you'll be signing grant agreements with HUD sometime in September, mid to late September. That's typically what we've seen in past rounds. So you'd be looking at wanting to have a plan to get your projects off the ground, probably starting in October. And 2 years to implement a new project seems like a long time, but we really encourage that rapid implementation because it goes by really quickly. And what we've seen in past rounds is that it's really challenging to spend the funds down. So again, plenty of support when we get to that part of the process, but just good to know that in general, you'd be looking at a fall startup. And then finally, any project awarded would be expected to participate in whatever New Hampshire's continuous quality improvement process ends up looking like. So like we've said a few times now, y'all have this coordinated community plan. It includes, a number of action steps and objectives that the COC will work toward around ending homelessness. And part of that will be looking at, your youth serving projects, evaluating them, sort of looking at the impact, looking at, who's being served, how they're being served, identifying disparities. So awarded projects should expect to be participatory in whatever that process ends up looking like. When you do take a look at the Notice of Funding Opportunity documentation that is one of the governing sort of documents for YHDP, you will see a number of principles that HUD has identified as important to them and principles that they want to see in the projects that are designed and awarded in YHDP communities. So that's not to say that every single project should have a very specific plan to address each one of these principles, but just know and familiarize yourselves with them because these are not only priorities for HUD, but many of them, if not all, were identified as priorities for New Hampshire as well. So things like we've mentioned, youth choice, leading with equity, incorporating positive youth development and trauma-informed care, individualized and client-driven supports. All of these things that you should be thinking about when you're anticipating what your services and housing resources might look like in the projects you're applying for. And now I'm going to share a little bit about match requirements, everybody's favorite topic. So as recipients of this YHDP funding, you will be required to provide match to the awarded amount that your organization receives. And match is essentially just your organization's contribution to cover the costs of the project. So in New Hampshire, subrecipients are required to provide 30% match for the projects that they receive, except for the leasing budget line item, which I will explain in a couple of minutes. Match can be cash match, or it can be in-kind match, which might mean services or goods. So cash match could be something like maybe your organization has an unrestricted fund and you can use some of that money to provide administrative support to the project. That would be an example of cash match. While services match might look like your organization receives funding for supportive services, and you can use those services to support the young people enrolled in this project. That would be considered match to the project as well. It has to be documented in accordance with all of the Continuum of Care program requirements. So there's a lot of really great resources around how to document match. I'm sure that BHS has local resources around that and provides support, knowing y'all have COC
I was going to say,
programs.
I'm offering up Christy Schott as our match expert because she has done trainings on Continuum of Care match requirements. She's on this call as well, but again, BHS can support that. I want to explain the 30% piece because I think that it could cause some confusion. In the HUD documents, it says there's a requirement for a 25% match. The Balance of State Continuum of Care voted several years ago, I can't remember exactly when, to increase it to a 30% requirement at the beginning, like just so that we have a buffer. And the reason for that has been because sometimes our award amounts change from what we think we're applying for to what we actually get come grant agreement time because of fair market rent changes. And if it goes up just a little bit and we don't have, and now we're at like 24.3% match and not 25%, then it's a whole, like, we have to redo the match letters. We have to do issues and conditions for HUD to get the grant agreement processed. So it gives us a buffer. But when it comes to actually contributing match each month with the invoice, you're only required to actually meet the 25% for the total amount you spend. So the 30% is the buffer to make sure that our grant agreements get processed without any sort of delay. The actual amount that you are required to provide documentation for is 25% of what you spend. I hope that helps.
I'm going to interrupt for a hot minute. It's Christy. So typically what we have seen in the past years with the Continuum of Care projects is that what you apply for in your projects, we have seen increases in the actual award amount. So that's why we've asked for this buffer. We've been lucky enough that usually award amounts are higher than what you're looking for. Keep your fingers crossed. But again, at the end of the grant, you're only required to match 25% of what was expended for the entire grant term. And I'm happy to answer any questions about match. And I don't know if I'm an expert, but I'll help.
So when we're going through the application process, we will pull Christy in for the match piece because we will have to have match letters with our submissions. So.
And we do have templates for all of you to utilize as well that we can share.
Yep. Awesome. Thank you both. Super helpful. And the last thing I'll just underscore on this slide is that whatever you're using as match has to be an eligible use of COC program funding. So you can't say, oh, we got money to buy young people cars. We're going to use that as match because you're not allowed to use COC program money to buy young people cars. So you just have to be thinking about if you want to use this as match, would we otherwise be able to pay for it with our YHDP funds? If not, it can't count as match. So these are just a couple of examples to get folks thinking. I shared some of them already. You know, if you were to receive a grant from a local foundation that you could use at your own discretion, that could be something you could put toward match for your project. If you had a project where you were operating it in with a leasing model, so your organization was leasing units in the community and then subleasing to young people, they would be paying rent to your organization or paying their occupancy fee to your organization. That's considered program income. That can be used as match. If your organization has, you know, counseling services or other supportive services that will be provided to the young people enrolled, that can be counted as match as well. It's also important to note what is not match. So anything that is not allowable to be paid for under the COC program or under YHDP is not match. Any sort of cash or in-kind contribution that's being used as match for another federal grant cannot be used as match for this program, for that, you know, your project. And then anything that's provided directly to the young people enrolled is also not match. So if a young person in your project receives SNAP benefits or health insurance through the state, any sort of benefits like that, those are not matched to the project because they're going directly to the young people. They're not contributions to the project itself. And then I just want to show this little sample, very basic budget, but to highlight what I said earlier around the leasing budget line item. So the types of projects that you all may apply for that have housing in them, the COC program pays for housing with two different types of funding, either rental assistance or leasing dollars. And they do not require that you provide match if your project has leasing dollars to whatever that amount. So in this example, you'll see a project that the total budget is $135,000 in that center column. They have $100,000 for supportive services, $20,000 for leasing, $5,000 for HMIS, and $10,000 for project administration. They would need to provide match not to the whole $135,000, but rather to $115,000 because they would remove that $20,000 from the match, you know, from the total budget for considering match. The other thing that's worth highlighting here is that when you're thinking about match, let's say your project only had, you know, supportive services and a project administration line item. You can provide match for budget categories that you don't have in your project. So they don't have to match directly. Or let's say, for example, you had a project that only had rental assistance and admin. Your match could be supportive services dollars, even though you don't have that in your formal budget. So you don't have to match line to line is essentially what I mean. Okay, just a few more, and then we will get to open Q&A. So possibly the most exciting thing about YHDP is that HUD has said, we want this to be as innovative as possible, still working within, you know, the guardrails of HUD funding and what is required. But they wanted to give folks flexibility to design projects that could, in fact, meet the unique needs of young people, that could do more or do things differently than what COC program funding has done in the past. So in Appendix A of the Notice of Funding Availability that y'all were awarded under, there is a list of flexibilities under Section C. They call it highlights. And these flexibilities allow your projects to do things differently than they would typically be allowed to under the COC program interim rule. This includes things like paying for household items that a young person might need when they move into a new apartment. Things like cleaning supplies or linens or pots and pans. Under the COC program, you can't pay for any of that. But with this flexibility, You can say, we see a need for that in this project, we want to pay for that, and you can do so up to $300, for example. So there are a number of flexibilities like that you all, as you're thinking about your project, should take a close look at, especially if you're familiar with COC funding already and may feel a little boxed in or restricted by what you can and cannot do. There may be some wiggle room there that you're not yet aware of. There are 2 different types of flexibilities in that list. Most of them do not require any kind of HUD approval. They basically say you just have to identify that you want to do this in your project application. There'll probably just be a little line where you say, yep, we want to do C1, C5, C10, C12, whatever. And you want to identify, even if you're not positive you'll do it, identify it, get it in that grant agreement anyways, just so you have the flexibility if you want it. And then there are some that do require HUD approval. So these are some of the flexibilities that HUD sees as a little bit more consequential, and they want you to provide a letter requesting it and with some justification for why you need that flexibility in particular. And when we get to that stage, TA will be able to provide a lot of support for projects that want to request those flexibilities that require approval by the Deputy Assistant Secretary. So these are just some examples that I wanted to share with folks to hopefully get you thinking a little bit about what you might be able to do. So the host home stipends are new under the COC program for YHDP specifically. You can provide up to $500 to a host family or to a kinship care situation. Typically in COC program, rapid rehousing projects are required to have a lease between the tenant and the landlord, and then rental assistance can be provided on behalf of that tenant. But in YHDP, they've provided some flexibility where you could do a sponsor-based situation where, like I mentioned a bit ago, an agency could lease a unit in the community or rent that unit and then sublease it to the young person. Some communities have found value in that. Maybe they encounter a lot of landlords who are unwilling to rent to young people because they lack housing history, for example. This is one way to incentivize landlords because it's the agency on the hook for the lease. And it's a great way to help young people build that housing history. So that's another thing to consider. Typically, the COC program requires leases of a term no less than 1 year, but HUD has said, we understand that young people might need more flexibility than that. You can do leases of any term as long as it's at least month to month. Those startup costs, like I mentioned, up to $300. Gas for participants' personal vehicles. This is new. HUD has always said, no, you can't pay for a gas for your program participants. In YHDP, they're saying you can. This is not the full list. I think there's like 12 or 15 in the list entirely, but I just wanted to share some of what's there. And those do not require approval. So those are ones that you can just identify, we want to do this. Some of the ones that do require approval are, I mentioned earlier, providing a longer term rapid rehousing intervention, so up to 36 months rather than the 24. That would require a letter to say, hey, we want to do this, here's why. They've also put it out there that folks could request a waiver to the match requirement. That would also require approval from HUD. There's a couple of others in there that require that formal approval, but again, we'll provide you with support if you are looking to do something that requires one of those letters along with your grant application.
And that Appendix A does have more details about like when you can request certain waivers, because it's not just, I don't think it's as simple as just, oh, I'd love to have the waiver. I think there are some requirements to some of those. So take a look. And then if you have questions, reach out.
Yeah, definitely. And that's all of the formal content that we had. So I'm going to stop talking now and we can have some time to open it up if folks have other questions or anything at all for our last 20 minutes or so.
I see Lisa has her hand raised. Go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I always have like tons of questions.
It's okay.
And some of them are more for my edification. So of the list of the target populations, one of my questions had been about undocumented immigrants, and I'm just wondering if there's, if anyone has an undocumented youth immigrant, is there a required reporting to immigration authorities or anything like that? No.
Yeah, it's interesting. So HUD has said there are certain life-saving interventions that we fund that we don't want you to restrict access to based on immigration status. They have also said there are some things that we do think folks should be, have an eligible immigration status in order to access. But the key thing here that I always like to highlight is that nonprofit only government entities are required to ask about immigration status. Nonprofit organizations are not. So, for example, I used to do rapid rehousing in Boston, and we were a subrecipient of the State Department of Housing and Community Development. If they were the entity directly administering the funding, they would have to ask for folks' immigration status in order to give them the assistance. But because it was coming through my organization and we were a nonprofit, we didn't have to ask about immigration status. And so you can kind of plead ignorance in that way. I don't know if this is good technical assistance to be providing in this space, but it allows you to serve a very vulnerable population that may otherwise be.
So in terms of, any scoring that might happen, because the eligible applicants include, government organizations, there could be two very different kind of structures in place, right, for that particular target population. One where it's required that one seeks the information and then the nonprofit's not. Is that correct?
So what I'll say is BHS is the applicant for all of the balance of state grants. We're the recipient, we have subrecipients. The subrecipients follow their rules with their projects. And we'll just leave it at that. We are not the ones providing the services. We subcontract out to subrecipients. You have your own agencies, your own policies. You're only required to follow the grant agreement and contract, not federal reporting, because you're not a federal or you're not a government agency. I hope that helps.
Yeah, and there is I like Matthew put in the chat, it's a little don't ask, don't tell. And there's even a little more nuance where, rapid rehousing doesn't fall under that. So any entity could provide rapid rehousing to anybody. So we'll definitely work with funded projects to sort that out, especially those that are in areas where they anticipate seeing a number of immigrant or refugee, for sure.
This is a little bit new to me. Like, somebody sent this to me as a family resource center in the Franklin Tilton area because we've been having a terrible time housing anybody. And we've had kind of tragically, like, some youth that we've worked with that were homeless while they were in school. There was support because of McKinney-Vento and things like that. But then there's been this kind of gentrification going on in the Franklin area with the incoming water park, and we are losing all of what was affordable housing for young people in our area. Like, overnight, this has been happening. And just thinking, like, will this grant like fund smaller projects? Because I'm listening to like the idea of, like, if the Family Resource Center rented like 3 apartments and just worked with 3 kids that were substance use involved, that were, we've done a lot of training with actually UNH to have 6 of our recovery coaches that are co-trained in family supports now, and in working with youth that could provide like that kind of peer support for that youth if we were able to house them. Because what's been happening is we work with them while they're in the community, but they end up going to Manchester or other places to find housing that's not safe. And like, we just lost somebody to an overdose in Manchester that we had worked with, but then we lose connection when they leave our communities. So I'm just wondering, because this was sent to me and I thought, well, we don't really do housing. We work. Freeman Toth is like our hero at CAP, but just thinking about, is there something like local small that we could do to just help a few kids at a time to see how it goes,
Melissa, you just made me think of something I didn't say that's very important to note. One, yes, you all are welcome to apply for as much or as little funding as you see in your vision of a project, and projects can apply for funding with partners. So you say you don't do housing. If you have an entity in your area that you work with that does, you all could go in on an application together where maybe your organization provides those supportive services. They are familiar with administering rental assistance, so they take that part. Folks can apply, as a primary subrecipient and then a subrecipient. There's a lot that you can do there to be creative and leverage one another's expertise to meet the needs in your area.
Yep. And I was going to say the exact same thing, Ellen. In our continuum of care projects, we have just one at the moment, I think, that is a partnership where two different entities are working together to do the work. But I was going to say the same thing. It never hurts to put an application in with your vision. Again, we can't promise anything, until the scoring committee reviews everything. But even if you're not funded, I feel like it's a really good opportunity to sort of get the scope of HUD, because HUD doesn't make much sense. It takes many, many years. Like Christy, who's on the call here, she's been doing it for a long time and she knows it better than anyone I know. But she's been doing it for 6-7 years. So put it together. If you aren't funded because there are too many applications, we'll get you the feedback and that could help you think for future project applications. Because there's still the regular continuum of care process that could potentially have bonus funding available for new projects. It wouldn't have all of these flexibilities, but it could be very similar and you could propose a youth focused project through that as well. So I think it's always a helpful process to go through so you can start seeing what's needed to get these projects in place.
And I think to find out who are the partners that might be looking at Franklin and Tilton, because I feel like one of the reasons why we open these centers, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, and more recently in Franklin, is because there's been this hole in services because people are so far away from Concord and Laconia, as far as like the hubs of where the services are. So I just wonder, what could be done, maybe to partner with some other bigger organization, maybe, in that area.
Yeah, and Michelle, I'll just share an example to your point. In round 3 of YHDP, I worked with the Maine statewide continuum of care, and they awarded a project that is in a super rural part of the state up north of Bangor, and they saw a need for host homes there, and it is super small. They have funding to provide up to 4 host homes at a time. So it's a teensy project. It's like $150,000, but they saw a need and they similarly really wanted to address some of those underserved, more rural areas. And so I wouldn't, I definitely think leverage the strength of your partners and be thinking about your own administrative capacity, but I wouldn't worry that like any project is too small.
And I will echo that as I oversee the continuum of care projects. We have projects from $40,000 up to over $250,000. So it's really up to your agency to decide the funding amount and what you're looking for and what you want to start with. There's also the opportunities to expand those projects later on as well.
Not through YHDP, Christy. YHDP doesn't have the same rules as regular COC, which does have expansion opportunities. So maybe in the future they'll build that in.
Let's hope so.
Yeah. So what you're applying for YHDP right now is what's out there until HUD changes their mind, which, to be fair, happens all the time. So I just don't want to give false hope that there are expansion opportunities when there aren't yet.
I did want to ask on the data systems that you mentioned, is that something that the state funds separately from the project, or is that something we would have to buy into to do that reporting?
You would have to purchase a license, which is changing because we're changing data systems. It's around $100, a little over $100 for the year.
Okay. We have Recovery Link and QuickBase, so I know that sometimes those can be very cumbersome and costly. So I just wanted to ask about that. Thanks.
And the cost of using and like those licenses, those are eligible project costs in the of your YHDP project.
I was typing this out, but it'll be faster for me to just say it. One of the things we did in Mass when we did this was we created essentially an email listserv that shared amongst agencies of I do the housing piece, I'm willing to do it in these areas, et cetera, and someone else that's I do the programming piece, I'm willing to do it in these areas to help make some of those connections and linkages. That may make some sense in this case, because there is we do a fair amount of the housing side of stuff, and there's benefit in someone that knows the housing people and knows people who rent to our kids and don't rent to our yada yada yada. Just makes it easier and quicker, and making those connections can be helpful. Anyway.
Yeah, I appreciate that. We have a roundtable in Laconia that has done really well at collaborating. It's just, this is this new environment where what used to be the real inexpensive apartments we could rent down on Main Street, they're not accessible anymore. They've all been renovated. They're all thousands of dollars a month now. And all of a sudden there's this hole, and it's okay, how do we fill it?
Yeah. And one of the things that some of especially if you're doing, just for we rent couple of hundred units at this point. There are landlords that will rent to us that we just know because we rent a bunch of other places from them, and they'll give it to us for maybe not $500 but $950, and a number that's accessible and doable, kind of a thing, because they know that we're going to rent this thing from them for the next 30 years, and so they're down for it, kind of a thing. So anyway, there's but yes, sourcing apartments is by far, has been, at least for us, the hardest part of doing YHDP, by far.
So I just put in the chat, I was starting to type a little more, that there are local groups that meet, different local, they all call themselves something different. Some call themselves coalitions, some call them, I don't know what they call themselves, but there are local groups in almost every region of the state. And I recommend connecting with your local groups about that, because if you put it out statewide, I do think you could run into some challenges if you have somebody from Berlin who's oh, I'll help you with the housing part, but you're located in Tilton. So I just think it would be easier locally if you have those closer partnerships. So work with your local groups, I think would probably be easier, just my opinion. How are we doing on time, Ellen? We've got 5 minutes left. And so just know, everyone, that this isn't the end of your opportunity to ask questions. You can send us emails. This is a little bit different from, it's wildly different from a DHHS procurement where nobody's allowed to talk to you about anything ever. And it's different from our regular continuum of care process, which is somewhere in the middle. It's a little bit quieter. You can email us with questions. We can't do your applications for you. We can't create your project, but if you have a question about eligibility or you don't understand some of the HUD language, I think we can help with that part, right, Ellen?
Definitely.
Hi, this is Cindy, and I just wanted to say thank you to everything that you guys are doing. This YHDP grant is such a great opportunity for so many people. I know there's limited funding and not everyone's going to get what they're applying for, but just the fact that we have this as an opportunity. And I'm really grateful and thankful that you have also added the host homes as part of the potential projects that could be submitted. I know that the Manchester CLC did not put that in there, so I'm really glad that the Balance Estate did. So thank you very much for everything you're doing.
All right. Any other questions from anyone? All right. I think we might be good. So we will get the recording of this posted on the DHHS YouTube channel. Heidi knows how to do that, so I'll have her work on figuring that part out. Once it has been posted, we'll share that link, and we'll also share the slides with that one edit that Ellen, that you caught earlier. So we'll get that all sent out to everyone. And as a reminder, applications are due May 13th. All right. Thanks, everyone. And Ellen, don't forget to save the chat.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.